The moment I sent those login credentials to Evelyn Hart, my hand did not shake. I already knew where this was going. Because over the 3 evenings before that, I had quietly built a place for the truth to land. Not for revenge. Not to prove I was smarter than anyone else. But because after 14 years of being treated like the shadow behind every win, I understood that sometimes real work only becomes visible when the counterfeit collapses in front of people who are qualified to recognize it. The moment I pressed send on those login credentials for Evelyn Hart, there was nothing impulsive in me. I did not do it because of a sudden flash of anger. And I did not do it because I wanted to watch someone be humiliated just to satisfy some private bitterness. I had spent too many years inside conference rooms filled with polished promises to know better than that. Emotion, without evidence, is just noise. My name is Clara Whitman. I am 54 years old, divorced, and the mother of 2 sons. One of them had just finished his degree, and the other still had a year left before graduation. I had worked at Apex Federal Consulting in Dallas for 14 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a systems engineer at Boeing Defense. Federal compliance was never just a collection of acronyms to decorate a slide deck for me. FISMA, CMMC 2.0, FedRAMP High, ITAR. Those were real boundaries between a contract surviving an audit and a client losing its clearance status. I knew those regulations the way a mechanic knows the sound of an engine. One rhythm slightly off, and I could tell something underneath was about to fail. So when Evelyn asked for access, I could already see the entire trajectory of what would happen next. I knew what she would download, what she would rename, what she would claim as her own. I also knew that if the truth was ever going to be seen, it had to be placed in the right room, in front of the right people. People capable of understanding the consequences of a false strategy, and during the 3 evenings before that, I had prepared exactly that. My annual reviews at Apex could almost have been copied and pasted from one year to the next without anyone noticing. Clara delivers outstanding technical results, but needs to develop executive presence. It sounded polite, even constructive. But after enough years, I understood the real translation. It meant I could do the work, but I did not look like the person they wanted standing on the stage. I solved complex risk problems, built compliance frameworks, and saved proposals from errors that could have cost clients their contracts. But when it came time for handshakes, photographs, signature, and praise, the person in front was usually the one who spoke more smoothly. I had been passed over for director 4 times. The first time, I asked myself what I was missing. The second time, I tried to improve how I presented. The third time, I understood the problem was not my competence. By the 4th time, I stopped expecting anything different. That was not bitterness. It was how a person learns to live inside a system that prefers polish over foundation. What kept me there was not blind loyalty. It was the work itself. Federal compliance is not glamorous, but it matters. When you get it wrong, clients do not just lose money. They can lose contracts, clearances, sometimes the business they spent decades building. The people who truly understood what I built, the procurement officers, the compliance leads, the people who had to defend every assumption in front of federal auditors. They knew its value. They asked for me by name in follow-up meetings. They asked me directly, instead of asking the person with the cleaner title. For a long time, that was enough to keep going. But enough to continue is not the same as enough to accept being erased forever. When Apex won the Ironclad Government Solutions engagement, a $28 million contract to rebuild their entire federal contracting division, I allowed myself to believe this one might be different. Victoria Hale, our managing partner, said my name directly in the kickoff meeting. She said my compliance background was exactly what Ironclad needed. I remember sitting there, calm on the outside, while something small shifted inside me, like a door that had been jammed for years had opened just a crack. That evening, I started building the strategy. I did not wait for anyone to remind me. I did not need encouragement. When the right problem landed inside my expertise, my body almost knew what to do on its own. But that same week, HR sent a company-wide announcement. Apex had brought in someone from McKinsey, a rising star who would transform federal client relationships and bring fresh thinking into government contracting. The email included a photo of Evelyn Hart, 30 years old. Wharton MBA. With the kind of confident smile a person develops when no federal procurement officer has ever questioned one of her assumptions to the bone. The following Monday, Victoria introduced her at the all-hands meeting. Evelyn would spearhead the ironclad engagement. Then, almost as a footnote, she said Clara would handle all strategic development, research, and technical execution. Handle. I had heard that word so many times that it no longer struck cleanly. But it still left a mark. It meant I did the work while someone else took the meeting. I built the floor while someone else stood on it. I might get the footnote, while they got the handshake. If you are listening to this, and you have ever watched your work placed under someone else's name, comment number 1, so I know you understand that feeling. Evelyn came to my office that same afternoon. She did not knock. I had noticed something small over the years. People who do not knock are often not very familiar with asking permission in other areas either. She leaned against the doorway, scanned my Boeing defense commendations and the stack of federal compliance manuals on my credenza, then delivered a line she had clearly rehearsed. She said she had heard I was the expert around here, and that she was excited to collaborate. I said I looked forward to it too. But she had already turned away before I finished the sentence. By the second week, the pattern was obvious. Client emails were forwarded to me with a few words at the top. Handle this. No context. No thank you. Not even a question. When I suggested that Evelyn join a call with Ironclad's compliance team so she could understand their specific requirements, she told me her time was better spent on strategic visioning. I would take care of the technical side. She would handle the client relationships. It sounded like role division, but it was really a hierarchy. She kept the spotlight. I carried the weight. Noah Bennett, a 27-year-old junior account manager and the kind of person who actually paid attention in meetings, stopped me in the hallway. He hesitated, like he was not sure whether he should say anything. Then he told me Evelyn had told Victoria that the Northrop compliance framework came from her previous experience at McKinsey. I had built that framework over 3 weeks, with every assumption documented and every regulation cited. I looked at Noah and thanked him for telling me. Then I told him to keep his head down and keep watching. When a system is used to handing credit to the louder person, in the safest advice is sometimes this: do not step out too early. Not until the evidence is heavy enough. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. At 6:15. I was deep inside the real ironclad strategy when Evelyn walked in. Still without knocking. She carried the energy of someone who had already decided the answer before asking the question. She said she needed my login credentials for the Ironclad project folders because she was assembling the preliminary deck for the Friday checkpoint and needed access to all working documents. It was not a request. It was an order dressed in a professional voice. I told her the folders contained ITAR-restricted materials. Those files were working drafts, not client-ready deliverables. That kind of content had handling protocols. Evelyn waved her hand, as if I had said something outdated and inconvenient. She said those were legacy restrictions, that she understood what she was doing, and that I should just email her the credentials. I could have pushed back right there. I could have walked down to Victoria's office and made it her problem. I could have escalated, documented, and requested a formal authorization chain. All of those would have been the correct corporate responses. But the correct process does not always make the truth visible. I remembered something a senior engineer at Boeing once told me: sometimes the best way to teach someone about consequences is to let them experience those consequences directly. I looked at Evelyn and told her I would send them. Everything she needed would be in the Ironclad final deliverables folder. She left without saying thank you. If this story is speaking directly to something you have lived through, give this video one like, because there are a lot of people doing real work out there who still have not been seen. After Evelyn left, I sat still for a moment, staring at the screen as if I were looking at a door that had just opened by itself. Then I created a blank folder on my desktop and started working. What most people outside the field do not understand about federal compliance is that violations do not always look like violations. If an error is obvious at first glance, it usually does not get very far. The dangerous ones are the things that look clean. Things with charts, colors, and strategic language that sounds perfectly reasonable, while the foundation underneath is completely wrong. A deck can look like something from an elite consulting firm and still collapse the moment a procurement officer examines one core assumption. I knew exactly which foundations would collapse. Over 3 evenings, after Evelyn left the office, usually around 6:30, I built what I privately thought of as my insurance policy. I did not write nonsense. I did not create cartoonish mistakes. I built documents that were wrong in ways someone unfamiliar with the federal environment might miss, but that any real practitioner would recognize immediately. That was the point. I did not want the trap to depend on luck. I wanted it to depend on the difference between confident presentation and actual competence. At the same time, I built the correct strategy in a separate password-protected folder. I have never allowed myself to destroy something without having the right solution ready behind it. The real work still had to exist. The client still deserved what they were paying for. If false work collapsed and nothing accurate stood behind it, that would only be chaos. I did not want chaos. I wanted the truth to have structure, timestamps, metadata, and every path it needed to defend itself. The first file was titled Brand Positioning Strategy. I put serious effort into the presentation positioning maps, competitive analysis, and clean color-coded strategic quadrants. At first glance, it looked like something you might see in an expensive consulting deck. The core recommendation pushed Ironclad toward expansion into commercial markets. On paper, the logic was smooth. The argument seemed tight, and the language felt modern. But for the type of contract Ironclad held, it was a direct OPSEC violation. Classified defense capabilities cannot be marketed to commercial entities as a growth opportunity. Any executive with 6 months of defense contracting experience would see that immediately. Someone with a Wharton MBA and a McKinsey background who had never lived inside federal compliance might not. The second file was a campaign creative brief. I spent hours on the visuals alone: mood boards, tone guidelines, messaging pillars. The entire emotional direction was built around transparency, open communication, and public accessibility. It was warm, approachable, and designed to build trust. For a defense contractor dealing with classified work, it was exactly the wrong direction. The brief read beautifully, and that was what made it dangerous. It would have triggered a security review almost immediately. The third file was the media allocation plan. And I almost had to admit I made that one too attractive. The spreadsheet had quarterly breakdowns, ROI projections using real figures, and professional-looking allocations. 60% of the digital budget was assigned to social media platforms that federal employees are prohibited from accessing during working hours. I used actual rate cards. The math was correct. The strategy was useless. It was like designing a recruitment campaign for an audience that, by regulation, was not allowed to respond. The remaining 4 files followed the same principle: a surface polished enough for someone hungry for authority to believe she could present it, and a core flawed enough that a real expert could not ignore it. The fourth file was a social media content strategy built around real-time engagement and transparency. Almost every element would have triggered OPSEC violations within the first month of execution. The fifth was a partnership and vendor recommendation list. The companies were real. The names sounded reasonable, and the rationale looked solid. But not one vendor had achieved CMMC Level 2, which meant that for Ironclad's security tier, every one of them was disqualified before the conversation even began. The sixth was a pricing model. It was detailed, properly formatted, and referenced actual market rates. But the GSA schedule calculations were wrong in a very specific way. They used commercial rate structures for a federal acquisition contract. An experienced contracting officer would catch it in under a minute. The seventh was the compliance framework, the most precise piece in the entire false set. It cited real regulations, used the right terminology, and appeared thorough. But it applied FedRAMP moderate standards to a contract requiring FedRAMP high. That difference is not minor. It can invalidate an entire security authorization. I embedded the initials CW into each file's metadata. set creation timestamps from weeks before Evelyn joined Apex, and kept the naming conventions consistent with my standard system. Then I built the real strategy, CMMC-compliant vendors. ITAR clean messaging, a FedRAMP high authorization framework, correct GSA pricing, and sourced assumptions throughout. I also added a background logging script to the shared drive to record access, downloads, renames, everything. If you want to hear more stories where real work stands up against counterfeit confidence, and subscribe to the channel right here. Because the most important part is still ahead. I sent Evelyn the credentials at 6:30 that evening with one line: everything you need is in the ironclad final deliverables folder. I did not add a warning. I did not explain at length. I did not use sarcasm. A good trap does not need to make noise when it closes. It only needs someone to walk into it because she believes she is smarter than all the rules around her. Within 2 hours, the logging script showed that Evelyn had downloaded all 7 files. By the next morning, I had a complete record download times. Which files were opened? Which files were copied? Which files were renamed? When I checked the properties on her copies, I saw that my initials had been removed and the headers had been reformatted under the name Evelyn Hart. I took screenshots of every change, every timestamp, every small trace she assumed no one would care about. The next morning at stand-up, Evelyn presented the frameworks as if she had been up all night creating them. She said she had worked late, pulling everything together, and that the strategic direction was genuinely groundbreaking. I sat there, taking notes, listening to every word. Noah Bennett raised his hand from across the table. He asked whether the positioning appeared to target commercial markets, and whether that made sense for a classified contractor. Evelyn smiled without missing a beat. She said that was exactly the kind of traditional thinking we needed to move past, and that sometimes real strategy made traditional defense people uncomfortable. I wrote the sentence down word for word. Not because it was impressive, because I knew that at some point, a sentence that confident and that empty would need to be placed beside evidence so everyone could see how empty it really was. Over the following weeks, she sent the files directly to Ironclad's leadership, attached her name as lead strategist, and mentioned me as research support. When she mentioned me at all, the preliminary review with Ironclad was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Evelyn had already sent the 47-slide deck in advance the previous Friday, which meant there was no soft way to walk it back anymore. Ironclad's main conference room was on the 12th floor of their building in downtown Dallas. The moment you stepped inside, you knew this was not a room built for vague language. One wall held glass cases filled with trophies for defense, innovation, and competition. The other displayed photographs from procurement ceremonies and senior government meetings. The mahogany table was long enough to seat 25 people comfortably. There were no decorative plants, no motivational posters, nothing soft to blur the fact that every surface in the room spoke about results. 14 people filed in. Marcus Reed, Ironclad's CMO, took a seat near the center. He had the expression of someone who had heard enough contractor pitches to know within the first 10 minutes whether his time was being wasted. Margaret Blake, Ironclad's CEO, sat at the head of the table. She had spent 30 years in federal procurement before building Ironclad, and she carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need performance. The room naturally oriented around her without anyone being told. The remaining seats filled with procurement officers, compliance leads, 2 members of the legal team, and several senior directors. These were people who had not merely read regulations, they had lived with the consequences of getting them wrong. I sat in the second row. Laptop open. Silent. Evelyn arrived early, shook hands, made practice small talk, and carried the kind of energy that could be mistaken for leadership until it was tested. The opening slides were safe. Company overview, mission alignment, industry context, and the kind of statements that were correct enough not to invite interruption. Evelyn moved through them smoothly. I had to be fair, she was good at the performance part. Her pacing was controlled, her eye contact was clean, and she knew how to pause before a key point to make it feel heavier than it was. If you did not know what was waiting behind it, you might have thought the meeting was going well, but slide 5 changed the temperature in the room. The positioning map appeared on the screen, with the commercial market expansion strategy placed at the center of the recommendation. Marcus Reed's expression shifted before Evelyn finished her sentence. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, and the look of someone doing quick mental math and realizing the numbers did not fit. He asked her to walk him through the market focus. His tone was still neutral, still professionally courteous. Evelyn said her research showed significant untapped potential in the commercial sector, and that this represented a paradigm shift in how defense contractors approached market positioning. Margaret Blake spoke then, her voice even, but cutting straight through the polished language. She reminded Evelyn that this contract involved classified defense capabilities. Marketing those capabilities to commercial entities would put Ironclad's clearance status at immediate risk. That was not a paradigm shift. It was a compliance violation. I looked at Evelyn. Her smile was still there, but it no longer sat securely on her face. That was the first moment she realized this room did not operate on impressions. It operated on people who could tell the difference between a sentence that sounded intelligent and a sentence that could survive a federal audit. Slide 6 made everything move faster. Marcus had his tablet out and was cross-checking. He said Evelyn was citing FedRAMP moderate exemptions. While this contract operated at FedRAMP high, those two tiers could not be swapped through strategic language. Evelyn tried to say her approach challenged traditional framing. Marcus cut in. And this time, his tone no longer carried diplomatic softness. He asked whether she was seriously recommending that 60% of the digital budget be allocated to social media platforms that federal employees were prohibited from accessing during working hours. That question fractured the room. Not loudly. Not chaotically. But like controlled pressure finally releasing. The people who had been politely reserving judgment no longer needed to reserve anything. A procurement officer asked why she was recommending partnerships with vendors that had not achieved CMMC Level 2. Someone from the legal team said the pricing model used commercial GSA rates for a federal acquisition contract. A compliance lead pointed out that the social media strategy would trigger OPSEC violations within the first 30 days. Evelyn tried to answer each one. She used the words she knew: disruption, innovation, fresh thinking, challenging conventional frameworks. Those words might have survived inside a business school case study. They did not survive in this room, in front of these people. On these specific regulatory questions, each answer dug the hole a little deeper. Margaret Blake did not rush. She let everything play out until there was nothing left to rescue. Then she asked the question that ended the performance: what current CMMC 2.0 certification level was required for the scope of this contract? The room went quiet. It was the most basic question. Entry-level federal contracting knowledge. Evelyn opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. Then opened it again. Still nothing. Marcus Reed turned his head toward me. He called me Ms. Whitman and asked whether I had anything to contribute. Every eye in the room shifted at once to the second row. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes. Laptop open. Silence. Watching the whole structure come down exactly the way I had known it would. I stood, straightened my jacket, and said Level 2, requiring third-party assessment. Effective since March 2023. Margaret looked at me for a brief moment. It was not simple surprise. It was the look of someone rapidly deciding whether the person in front of her was a reliable source. Then she told me to continue. I walked to the front, connected my laptop, and opened the real strategy. The first slide was titled Federal Contracting Division Strategic Repositioning Framework. Ironclad Government Solutions. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Margaret folded her hands on the table and gave me her full attention. The procurement officers who had been exchanging comments a few minutes earlier went quiet. I began speaking, not with a triumphant voice, not with a desire to expose anyone. I spoke the way I had always spoken when the listener truly needed to understand, starting from contract scope, moving into security tier, vendor eligibility, messaging constraints, the FedRAMP high authorization path, GSA schedule pricing, and risk control. I explained why each recommendation existed, what assumptions supported it, what regulation anchored it, and which points required legal review before execution. There are rooms you have to win through presence. There are other rooms where you only need to place the right facts on the table. That day, I did not need to make myself larger. I only needed to let the real work stand where it belonged. Margaret called a recess and asked everyone to wait outside. Only she, Marcus, and I remained in the room. The air after a professional collapse has a very particular quality. It is not quite anger. It is a heavy kind of clarity. The kind that settles over responsible people when they realize they have come very close to making a dangerous and expensive decision. Margaret looked at me for a while before speaking. She said what I had done was a significant professional risk. I told her my responsibility was accurate strategy. I could not allow Ironclad to make a $28 million decision based on fabricated and unverified intelligence. Marcus was still reviewing the evidence folder on his tablet. It contained access logs, metadata, email trail, screenshots of every file rename, every timestamp, and every modification Evelyn had made after downloading the documents. He said the creation dates on those files predated Evelyn's start date at Apex by several weeks. He was not asking. He was confirming what he already understood. I said that was correct. Marcus looked up and said that in 15 years of federal procurement, he had seen contractors cut corners, exaggerate capabilities, and oversell experience. But he had almost never seen anyone do what I had just done. I did not take that as simple praise. It was also a reminder that I had stepped close to a dangerous line. But sometimes, inside a system too accustomed to ignoring the people who do the real work, absolute safety only means staying silent longer. Marcus set the tablet down and said he wanted me leading the engagement. Margaret nodded once. She asked whether I could deliver everything I had presented: the strategy, the vendor framework, the compliance architecture. I said yes. With a dedicated team and direct access to their security officers and procurement leads. She extended her hand. Then she said we should bring everyone back in. When the Apex team returned to the room, Margaret did not create drama. She did not circle the point. And she did not give anyone space to reinterpret what had just happened. She said Ironclad would move forward on one condition: Clara Whitman would lead the engagement. That was not a negotiating point. I watched Evelyn from across the table. The color left her face in about 2 seconds. She had walked into that room as the lead strategist on a $28 million federal contract. She was leaving it as someone who was about to have a very specific conversation with HR. Victoria Hale sat very still along the side wall. She had entered the meeting expecting to watch Evelyn close the deal. Instead, she watched 14 years of overlooked work appear on a screen in downtown Dallas and do exactly what it had always been capable of doing. She did not say anything in the room. She did not need to. That afternoon, Evelyn was out of the building before 3 o'clock, escorted by security. HR handled the documentation around unauthorized access faster than almost any process I had ever seen at Apex. At 3:30, Victoria sent a company-wide email. The subject line was Direct Organizational Update. Federal Strategy Division. 2 sentences mattered. Clara Whitman had been appointed Director of Federal Strategy. Effective immediately. Evelyn Hart was no longer with the organization. I read the email twice. 14 years. 4 passed-over promotions. 1 very deliberate Tuesday evening with a blank folder. 22 years of knowing exactly what federal compliance looks like when someone gets it wrong. I closed my laptop and went to get coffee. Not to celebrate loudly. Just to breathe. The weeks after that were different in ways I had not fully anticipated. Colleagues who used to pass by my office with another request now stopped to talk. Not to drop off work. Not to ask me to fix a model before a meeting. But to actually talk. A few of them told me their own versions of the same story analysis disappearing into someone else's presentation. Strategies credited to people who could not defend a single assumption behind them. Ideas taken away and then handed back as instructions. I realized I had not been alone. I had simply been the first person who documented everything carefully enough to do something when the moment arrived. 2 days after the Ironclad meeting, Victoria came to my office. She sat across from me and did not try to wrap the situation in management language. She said she had made assumptions she should not have made about who was driving results on the team. Then she paused and said that was on her. I told her I appreciated her saying it. And I meant it. She could have stayed silent. She could have turned the whole thing into a vague lesson about process. She could have said Apex had ultimately done the right thing and left it there. Many people in her position would have chosen the path that hurt them least. But she said it directly. That did not erase 14 years. But it placed the first brick where one should have been placed a long time ago. I also understood that recognition arriving late does not automatically heal everything. It only opens another room. And from there, you decide how to keep walking without lowering your head in the old way. The following week, Noah Bennett knocked on my office door. Actually knocked. That small detail made me smile before I even looked up. He stood outside with a slightly nervous expression and asked whether I would be willing to mentor him properly. Not quick hallway answers. Not rescuing him before deadlines, and then returning to our separate corners. He wanted to learn seriously. With structure. On a regular basis. I said yes without hesitation. Strangely, that was the moment that felt most like something had truly changed. Not the new title. Not the company-wide email. Not even the look on Marcus Reed's face when he said he wanted me leading the engagement. It was a young account manager standing in my doorway asking to learn the work, the right way, from someone who had spent 22 years learning it the hard way. For many years, I had thought my invisibility was a personal problem. I was not polished enough. I did not speak the right way. I did not make people sense power the moment I entered a room. But looking at Noah, I understood the problem was larger than me. If young people only see smooth talk rewarded, they will learn to speak smoothly before they learn to do the work correctly. If they only see real effort transferred into someone else's name, they will think that is the rule of the game. I did not want Noah to learn that way. I did not want anyone under my guidance to believe the only way to survive was to let someone else stand on their shoulders and call it leadership. So I started with the foundations, read the contract scope, understand the security tier, document assumptions. I know when to say no. And never build anything you cannot defend in front of someone who knows the rules. The Ironclad campaign launched 6 months later. On schedule. Under budget. And with no compliance flags at any stage of delivery. I do not say that as a line of self-promotion. In the world of federal contracting, every word in that sentence carries weight. Every vendor cleared CMMC Level 2 before contract execution. Every piece of messaging passed ITAR review. The FedRAMP High authorization went through without a revision request, which almost never happens on a first submission. In the first year, Ironclad saw a 12% increase in federal contract renewals and avoided $1.8 million in compliance costs. My name was on the final report, not in a footnote. At the top, I thought I might feel a sharper kind of victory when I saw that. Instead, the strongest feeling was quiet, a deep kind of quiet. Like a complex machine, finally running in rhythm after too many years of having the wrong part in place. Margaret Blake sent me a handwritten note after the launch. It was short. Direct. Exactly the way people who have spent decades in federal procurement tend to communicate. She wrote that integrity under pressure was rare. And thanked me for it. I framed that note and kept it on my desk. It will stay there. Not to remind me that I was finally seen, but to remind me that some clients, some projects, and some decisions are too important to be handed over to confident presentation without foundation. I am not invisible anymore. But I have to be honest about this: being seen was never the original goal. It was only the consequence of refusing to let false work travel farther than real work. I did not build those 7 files because I wanted a title. I did not stay late for 3 evenings because I wanted a company-wide email or a framed note on my desk. If that had been the goal, I probably would have been disappointed long before Ironclad ever appeared. I did it because I had watched fabricated work moving toward a client who deserved the real thing. And I was not willing to let that happen silently. The work matters. Getting it right matters. There are professions where a mistake only creates an uncomfortable meeting. But in federal compliance, a mistake can lead to investigations, lost clearance, lost contracts, and the collapse of trust. An organization spent years building. People outside the field sometimes think we are just the ones who say no. The ones who slow things down with checklists and clauses. They do not understand that every checklist is a barrier built after someone, somewhere, paid dearly. Every process exists because on the other side of it is a real risk. I spent many years working quietly, carefully, without asking for a stage. Partly because I believed the work would be enough on its own. Partly because I did not yet have a better option. But my lesson is not that you should stay silent forever and hope someone eventually discovers you. The lesson is to do the real work, but never let it exist without a trace. Do not hand the full value of your labor to someone else's memory. Memory can be convenient, selective, and reshaped to fit the story of whoever has power. Evidence is harder to persuade. When the truth needs to stand up, it should not have to begin by begging someone to remember. The one thing I tell people who have been sitting where I sat for 14 years is this: document everything. Not because you want to live in suspicion, but because you understand that the working world is not always fair to the people who do things correctly. Save emails. Keep version history. Use systematic file names, record assumptions, source, creation dates, and reviewers. Do the real work even when no one applauds immediately. But do not let the real work float around without ownership. The people who keep their heads down and do the work are not invisible because they lack ability. They are invisible because the system has not been looking in the right place. And when the moment of truth finally arrives, what matters is not who spoke louder, who entered the room with the more confident smile, or whose profile looked brighter in the introductory email. What matters is whether the work was actually there, whether it was accurate, whether it was documented, whether it was ready to speak for you when all you had to do was open your laptop and let the facts step into the light. I am not telling anyone to set a trap for revenge. Revenge is a fire that burns out quickly. I am telling you to build a place for the truth to land. With care, professional ethics, and records that cannot be wiped clean by a new name on a header. If my story gave you even a little more faith in doing the work correctly, thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please leave one like, subscribe to the channel, and remember that sometimes what makes you visible is not a louder voice, but real work finally placed before the right people.